Picture yourself standing on the mud bank of the Min River in southern China in the spring of the year 1866. The air smells of river silt and camphor wood and the particular green sharpness of fresh tea, thousands of chests of it, stacked on the docks in neat rows, each chest stamped and sealed and waiting. The sky is barely light. The junks are moving, slow and silent, carrying the first chests out toward the deep water anchorage, where 3 of the most extraordinary vessels ever built are riding at anchor, their tall masts sketching lazy arcs against the pale sky. Their names are Ariel, Taeping and Serica, and within the next 12 hours, all 3 of them will slip their moorings, fill their sails with whatever breath of wind the gods of commerce choose to provide, and begin a journey of 16,000 miles that will become one of the most celebrated contests in maritime history. Nobody that morning called it a race. There were no starting pistols, no formal rules, no judges, waiting at the finish line in London. There was only the tide and the bar at the mouth of the river, and the knowledge shared by every captain and every owner, and every merchant and every insurance broker in the China trade, that the first ship to unload its new season tea in the port of London would earn a premium that could change lives. The first chest of new season Foochow tea to reach a London warehouse commanded a price per pound that could be 4 or 5 times higher than the same tea arriving 3 weeks later. The economics were that brutal and that simple. Speed was money. Speed was everything. And so these 3 ships, already among the fastest sailing vessels ever constructed, loaded their cargoes through the night and the early morning, their crews moving in the disciplined choreography of men who understood that every hour counted, that the race had already begun on the dock rather than on the open sea. Stevedores carried chests down into the holds, and the mates counted and checked and directed, and the captains paced their quarterdecks and looked at the sky, and felt the direction of the breeze on their cheeks, and calculated, always calculated, what course to steer once the river mouth fell behind them, and China disappeared beneath the horizon. The year 1866 was not the first time ships had raced home from China with tea. It was not even the most famous race, though its conclusion would stun the world with its closeness. But it was the race that crystallized everything the Victorian age loved about itself: speed, daring, competition. The romance of distant shores translated into the steam of a teacup on a London breakfast table. In an era before submarines or aircraft or the internet, before any of the technologies that would eventually compress the world down to something a person could hold in their hand, the clipper ship was the fastest thing on Earth that could move a substantial cargo from one side of the world to the other, and the men who sailed them, and the men who built them, and the men who bet money on them, had turned the simple act of bringing tea home into something very close to a religion. To understand why, you have to understand what tea meant to the Victorian world. Not what it means now, when you can pick up 100 tea bags for the price of a bus fare, when the stuff sits in supermarket aisles beside the biscuits, and nobody thinks very much about where it came from, or who grew it, or how it got here. In 1866, tea was still something to be treated with reverence. Britain was consuming hundreds of millions of pounds of it every year, and every single ounce of that tea had to travel by sea from the other side of the planet. The new season's tea, the first flush, the finest leaves picked in the spring before the rains came, was a luxury even by the standards of a commodity already considered a luxury. Wealthy London merchants and society hostesses would pay extraordinary sums for the right to serve their guests the very first Foochow tea of the year, tea whose freshness had been preserved only by the remarkable skill and speed of the clipper captains. Every day the tea spent at sea was another day it was losing something of its character, another day the delicate volatile oils in the leaves were changing in ways that could not be reversed. Speed was not just profitable. Speed was the difference between delivering a transcendent experience and delivering a perfectly acceptable but ultimately ordinary cup of tea. So the men who competed in the China trade were not simply merchants or sailors. They were custodians of an experience, and they knew it, and they built their ships accordingly, and they drove those ships and those crews with an intensity that sometimes crossed the line between dedication and madness. The story of the tea clippers is the story of what human beings will risk, what they will sacrifice, what they will demand of wood and canvas and rigging and exhausted human bodies, in pursuit of a prize that is equal parts money and glory, and the pure competitive satisfaction of arriving first. To properly understand the great China races of the 1860s, You need to go back further than the ships themselves. You need to understand the world that created both the demand for speed and the extraordinary vessels that would try to meet it. And that world has roots that are tangled and sometimes uncomfortable, reaching down into the soil of empire and trade and the complex business of how the British got access to Chinese tea in the first place. For most of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the tea trade between Britain and China was a monopoly held by the East India Company, that enormous and extraordinary organisation that was at various times a trading house, a private army, a colonial government, and the dominant force in the economies of half the world. The company had a charter from the Crown that gave it exclusive rights to trade in the East, and it exercised those rights with a thoroughness that left no room for competition. Ships sailed on company terms, at company schedule, and what the company said went. Speed was not particularly valued. The company's ships, the famous East Indiamen, were large and heavily built, and designed more for carrying capacity and defensive armament than for racing across the Indian Ocean. They took their time. The tea arrived when it arrived. Then, in 1833, the East India Company's monopoly on the China trade was abolished. Parliament, influenced by the rising tide of free trade ideology, championed by economists from Adam Smith onward, decided that competition should be allowed to work its magic on the tea trade as on everything else. Almost immediately, a new generation of merchants and ship owners began to think about what a competitive tea trade might look like, and the answer they arrived at was faster, significantly faster. A ship that could make the round trip between Britain and China in less time than the old company ships meant a ship that could make more voyages per year, carry more tea per year, earn more money per year. The incentive to build fast ships was sudden and overwhelming. But there was another element driving the demand for faster ships, and it was less comfortable to talk about then and remains uncomfortable now. The opium trade. Britain, in one of the more morally complex episodes in the history of commerce, had found a way to balance its enormous trade deficit with China by shipping opium grown in India into Chinese ports, often illegally, often over the explicit objections of the Chinese government. The opium wars of the 1840s and 1850s were fought, at their core, over Britain's insistence on its right to sell a drug into China that was destroying the social fabric of entire provinces. The outcome of those wars forced China to open additional ports to British trade, to accept foreign merchants on Chinese soil, and to legalise the opium trade. It was a settlement that left deep wounds, and those wounds shaped the political context within which every tea clipper set sail. None of this was discussed on the London docks when a clipper was loading. The merchants who chartered the ships were focused on their contracts and their premiums and their delivery schedules. The sailors who signed on were focused on their wages and the quality of the cook, and whether the captain was a reasonable man or a tyrant. But the context was there, underneath everything. The fact that the extraordinary profits of the China trade, the wealth that funded the building of the clippers themselves, had been partly built on suffering that stretched from the poppy fields of Bengal to the opium dens of Canton. History rarely arrives without this kind of complexity attached to it. What emerged from the new competitive landscape of the mid-19th century was a distinct type of merchant vessel that had no real precedent. American shipbuilders, particularly those working in the yards of New York and Boston and Baltimore, had been developing a philosophy of fast ship design since at least the 1820s, influenced partly by the sleek lines of the Baltimore clippers used for privateering and smuggling and other activities that rewarded speed over capacity. When the California gold rush of 1848 and 1849 created overnight demand for fast ships to carry passengers and supplies around Cape Horn to San Francisco, American yards responded by scaling up this philosophy into full-sized ocean-going sailing ships of extraordinary proportions. Ships like the Flying Cloud, the Sovereign of the Seas, and the Lightning were not merely fast by the standards of their time. They were machines of such terrifying efficiency that their speed records would stand for decades, and some of them would never be beaten by sail. The British watched all this with keen professional interest and then set about building their own version of the clipper, somewhat different in character from the American model, somewhat more conservative in its extremes but no less competitive in intent. The result was a generation of British tea clippers built through the late 1850s and into the 1860s that represented, in the opinion of many naval architects who have studied them since, the absolute pinnacle of the sailing ship as a technology. These were ships that had been refined by decades of accumulated knowledge and competitive pressure into something very close to perfection, if perfection means achieving the maximum possible speed within the physical limits of wood and iron and canvas and rope. The clipper ship was not a single design. It was a philosophy, and like all philosophies, it expressed itself in different ways through different hands. But there were certain principles that united all the great clippers, certain solutions to the fundamental problem of getting a large wooden ship to move through water at speeds that had previously seemed impossible. The first principle was the hull. Traditional merchant ships, the kind built to carry maximum cargo with minimum crew and minimum risk, tended toward broad, deep hulls that sat heavily in the water and pushed an enormous bow wave ahead of them as they moved. They were stable and capacious, and they arrived eventually, which was all most cargoes required. The clipper hull was something entirely different. It was long relative to its beam, meaning long relative to its width, and it was fine at the bow, meaning the bow cut the water rather than pushing it aside. The midship section, the widest and deepest part of the hull, was moved further aft than in conventional ships, giving the clipper what builders called a cod's head and mackerel's tail shape when viewed from above. The bow was sharp and the stern was relatively fine, and this shape allowed the ship to slip through the water with dramatically reduced resistance. But hull shape was only part of the story. The other part was sail area. A clipper ship carried an extraordinary amount of canvas relative to its size, a towering spread of sail on 3 or sometimes 4 masts that could, in a good breeze, drive the hull at speeds that seemed to defy the laws of physics governing wooden ships. The tallest masts on a large clipper might rise 80 or 90 feet above the deck, and the full spread of canvas, including the large square sails on each mast as well as the fore and aft sails, and the various smaller sails set above the topsails and above those again, could cover an area of well over an acre. Managing all of this canvas in varying wind conditions was a complex and physically demanding art, and the crews of clipper ships were selected partly for their skill and partly for their willingness to climb to heights that would make most landlubbers simply stop breathing. The tension at the heart of clipper design was always between speed and safety, or more precisely between the desire to carry as much sail as possible, and the structural realities of what masts and spars and rigging could actually endure. Push too hard and you could lose a mast or a yard, the heavy horizontal spar from which the square sails hung, and a lost mast or yard in the middle of the Southern Ocean, with the nearest shipyard perhaps 2,000 miles away, was not merely an inconvenience. It could be a death sentence. The clipper captains who won races were not simply the ones who sailed fastest in fair weather. They were the ones who correctly judged, 1,000 times over the course of a voyage, exactly how close to the edge they could push their ship without going over it, who could read the weather and the sea state and the condition of their rigging, and make instant decisions that balanced the mathematics of speed against the reality of risk. The hulls of the tea clippers were built in composite construction, a technique developed by British yards in the 1860s that combined an iron framework with teak planking on the outside, iron for structural strength, teak for the smooth, clean bottom that sailing ships required to prevent the marine growth, barnacles and weed, that accumulated on wooden hulls below the waterline and could slow a ship dramatically over the course of a long voyage. The composite hull gave the tea clippers of the 1860s a structural rigidity that pure wooden hulls could not match, while retaining the smooth underwater surface that was essential for speed. It was a solution elegant in its simplicity and effective in its results, and the ships built using it were able to endure the extraordinary stresses imposed by carrying enormous spreads of canvas in the high winds of the Southern Ocean, in ways that earlier wooden ships could not have survived. The great yards that produced the tea clippers were concentrated in Scotland, particularly on the Clyde and in Aberdeen, though English yards at Sunderland and elsewhere also contributed significant vessels. The firm of Robert Steele and Company at Greenock built Ariel in 1865, and she was considered at the time of her launch to be the most perfect clipper ever produced, a judgment that many who saw her in full sail subsequently endorsed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for great works of art. She was 297 feet in length, with a beam of 33 feet and 9 inches, and she displaced 760 tons. These numbers do not convey what she looked like. What she looked like was a knife designed to slice through water, a black and white knife with 3 tall masts and a spread of canvas that in a good wind could drive her hull at 14 or 15 knots, speeds that would not be exceeded by a loaded cargo ship under sail, until the age of sail was already drawing to its close. The Taeping was built by Robert Steele as well, launched in 1863, and she was, if anything, slightly superior to Ariel in certain conditions, particularly in lighter airs where her fine lines gave her an advantage that Ariel's slightly heavier construction did not allow. The Serica, slightly older, was a fine ship but generally considered a step below the other two in the quality of her construction and the refinement of her hull form. She was fast enough to compete, as the 1866 race would demonstrate, but she was not in quite the same class. Above all these, built slightly later and for a slightly different purpose, stood the two ships that would come to define the clipper era in the public imagination. The Thermopylae, built by Hood at Aberdeen in 1868, and the Cutty Sark, built by Scott and Linton at Dumbarton in 1869. These two ships were built specifically to beat each other, though this was not stated quite so boldly in the contracts. The men who commissioned and designed them were responding to competitive pressures that had been building for years, trying to produce something faster and more perfect than anything that had come before, and both of them largely succeeded in their ambitions. The story of Thermopylae and Cutty Sark is in some ways the culminating chapter of the Clipper era, and we will come to it in time. But first we need to understand the men who sailed these ships, because the ships themselves were only as fast as the captains who dared to push them. There is a particular type of human being that the Clipper era produced, and it is worth pausing to think about what that type was like, because the ship captains of the tea trade were not ordinary men operating in any ordinary way. They were, by the standards of their time, celebrities. Though that word did not yet exist in its modern form, their names were known to readers of the shipping news and the commercial press across Britain. Their exploits were discussed in the coffee-houses and gentlemen's clubs of the City of London. When a clipper captain made a record passage, when a ship arrived days ahead of expectations after a run down the Atlantic that defied the weather and the mathematics, the captain's name was in the newspapers and toasts were drunk in his honour in establishments where a man had to be someone to get through the door. Captain John Key, who commanded the Ariel in the Great Race of 1866, was 42 years old that year and had been going to sea since he was a boy. He was not a large or physically imposing man, by the accounts that survive him, but he had about him that quality that the best clipper captains all seem to share, a quality that might be described as an absolute refusal to accept the possibility of defeat. Kay did not sail his ship. He inhabited her. He understood her in the way that a very skilled musician understands an instrument, felt through the deck beneath his feet every nuance of the way she was moving through the water, knew by the sound of the rigging in the wind and the way she responded to the helm, whether she was being sailed at her best or whether some small adjustment, a sheet eased here, a brace hardened, there, a different angle to the wind would bring something more out of her. This intimate knowledge of the ship was not merely technical, it was almost instinctive, built up over years of watching and feeling and making mistakes and learning from them, a body knowledge that could not be fully articulated or written down or transferred to another person through instruction. You could not teach someone to be a great clipper captain. You could teach them navigation. You could teach them seamanship. You could teach them how to read a barometer and what the different types of cloud formation told you about the weather coming. But the final quality, the thing that separated Kay from a perfectly competent officer, was something that had to be grown rather than learned. Captain Donald Mackinnon of the Taeping was a different personality, by all accounts quieter and more reserved than Kay, a Scot with the economy of expression and the quiet stubbornness that the stereotype suggests and that, in his case, appears to have been accurate. He was perhaps a more precise sailor than Kay, less inclined toward spectacular risks and more inclined toward the sustained intelligent application of every small advantage, the kind of captain who won races not with one brilliant decision, but with 10,000 small correct ones accumulated over 99 days at sea. Beneath these captains were the mates, and beneath the mates were the crews, and it is worth saying something about those crews because they are often the invisible people in the story, their names unrecorded and their lives undocumented in a way that makes them difficult to recover from the historical record. The ordinary sailors who crewed the tea clippers were a cosmopolitan and often desperate group. A clipper ship crew might include Scots, Irish, Englishmen, Scandinavians, Lascars from the Indian subcontinent, Chinese sailors hired in Hong Kong or Foochow, Pacific Islanders, and Americans. They were paid in the currency of whatever port they signed on in, and they were paid off again when they arrived, and there was no guarantee of a berth home. Many of them spent their lives in a kind of restless global circulation, moving from ship to ship, port to port, never quite settling, always chasing the next voyage and the next wage. Their living conditions on a clipper ship were extremely poor by any reasonable standard. The forecastle, the cramped bow section of the ship where the ordinary sailors berthed, was cold and damp and noisy, particularly in bad weather when the bow was driving through heavy seas and the ship was working in ways that could make sleep not merely difficult, but impossible. The food was monotonous and sometimes barely adequate, salt meat and hardtack being the staples, with fresh provisions lasting only the first few days out of port before the barrels and casks took over. Water was rationed. Grog was provided in some ships but not all, and the question of alcohol was one. The clipper captains navigated with varying degrees of strictness. The work was physically punishing in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a position of comfortable 21st century distance. Going aloft in bad weather, climbing the ratlines to the top of a mast that was swinging through an arc of 20 or 30 degrees as the ship rolled in heavy seas, and then working your way out along a yard that was flexing under the pressure of the sail and the weight of the men on it, to take in a sail whose canvas had been stiffened by spray to something close to iron, using your body weight and the strength of your arms to haul and secure the great folds of the sail, while the wind tried to tear it and you out of the rigging simultaneously. This was work that required extraordinary physical courage and skill, and it was work that the ordinary sailor performed not once on a voyage but dozens of times, in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely terrifying. Men died on these ships. They died in falls from aloft, sometimes seen by their shipmates and sometimes simply not there when the watch was called and their hammock found cold. They died in accidents with ropes under tension, ropes that could take off a finger or a hand or more if something gave way at the wrong moment. They died of illness in ports where disease was endemic. They drowned when a wave took them overboard in the Southern Ocean or the Bay of Biscay, and the ship sailed on without them because in most conditions it was impossible to turn a clipper ship around quickly enough to find a man in the water, and the captain had his orders and his cargo and his race, and the sea took what the sea claimed. None of this made the sailors who endured it extraordinary by their own lights. It made them sailors, which was in their world simply a category of person, the way carpenter or blacksmith was a category, with its own culture and its own hierarchy and its own set of skills and satisfactions. The extraordinary thing was not that individual sailors found this life bearable, but that generation after generation of young men chose it, signed articles and went aboard and endured the misery and the danger for wages that would seem absurdly inadequate to modern eyes, because the sea was what they knew, and the ship was home, and the next port was always somewhere new, and the passage was always an achievement, always something to measure yourself against and find that you had not been found wanting. The route from Foochow to London was not a single thing. It was a sequence of distinct environments, each with its own dangers and its own opportunities, its own weather patterns and its own navigational challenges, and a captain who understood each of these environments and knew how to manage his ship within them had a significant advantage over one who did not. The route was long enough that almost anything could happen, and often did. Foochow, which is now known as Fuzhou, sits on the Min River in the Fujian province of southeastern China, some 30 miles upstream from the sea. This was the great port of the tea trade in the 1860s, the place where the finest Kongu and Oolong teas from the mountains of Fujian were brought down by river junk to be loaded onto the clippers waiting in the anchorage. The river was shallow enough at its mouth that large ships could not simply sail straight in and out. They had to work with the tides, waiting for the flood tide to provide enough water over the bar at the river mouth, and this dependence on the tide was itself a source of competitive anxiety, because a ship whose cargo was fully loaded but which was stuck in the river waiting for the tide was a ship losing time to a rival that had already cleared the bar and was out in the open sea. From the Min River mouth, the early part of the voyage lay through the Taiwan Strait and into the South China Sea. This was not easy water in any season, but in the late spring and early summer, when the tea clippers were departing, it was particularly challenging. The South China Sea is subject to monsoon conditions that alternate between the northeast monsoon of winter and the southwest monsoon of summer, and the transition between these two seasonal wind systems created periods of unsettled weather with squalls and variable winds that could make navigation frustrating and sometimes dangerous. The Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, lying in the middle of the South China Sea, were poorly charted in the 1860s and represented genuine navigational hazards, particularly for ships running fast in reduced visibility. The passage south through the South China Sea brought the clippers to the choice of how to enter the Indian Ocean. There were two main options. The more direct route lay through the Sunda Strait between the islands of Sumatra and Java, passing through what is now Indonesia in a relatively narrow channel that was navigationally demanding but saved several days compared to the alternative. The alternative was the Strait of Malacca to the north, longer but somewhat less hazardous, though it had its own issues, including the presence of pirates and the navigational complexities of the Malacca roads. Different captains had different preferences, and the choice could affect the final result of a race. Once through into the Indian Ocean, the clippers faced the long crossing to the southwest. This part of the voyage offered some of the best sailing conditions of the entire route if the weather cooperated, with the southeast trade winds providing steady pushing breezes from behind or on the quarter that could drive a fast ship at consistent speeds day after day. But the Indian Ocean also had its moods, its calms and its sudden violent squalls, its areas of confused swell left over from distant storms, and the doldrums near the equator that could stop a ship dead for days while the crew watched the glassy water and prayed for wind. The approach to the Cape of Good Hope was the moment many captains both dreaded and anticipated. Dreaded because the Southern Ocean around the Cape is one of the most reliably violent stretches of water on Earth, a place where the great wind systems of the Southern Hemisphere, uninterrupted by any significant landmass, build swells of extraordinary height and generate gales that can last for days. Ships have been wrecked on the Cape Coast since European sailors first began rounding it in the 15th century, and the waters off the Cape and below it in the Southern Ocean were a graveyard for vessels whose captains misjudged the conditions or whose ships were not strong enough to endure them. Anticipated, however, because those same winds that made the Cape so dangerous were the same winds that could push a fast ship eastward at breathtaking speed on the right course, and a clipper that caught the westerlies at the right angle in the right season could make 300 miles a day through this section, which was extraordinary by any measure. The technique most favoured by experienced clipper captains for rounding the Cape was to stay well south of the land, sometimes venturing below 40 degrees south latitude, where the westerlies were strongest and most consistent, and where icebergs were also a genuine hazard. Running before a strong westerly in the Southern Ocean, in a heavily laden clipper, was among the most exhilarating and terrifying experiences available to a professional sailor of the 19th century. The ship would rise to each enormous swell, surge down its face with a speed that seemed impossible, and then drive into the trough at the base with a shock that tested every timber and every inch of rigging. Pooped, the sailors called it, when a following sea broke over the stern and swept the deck, and a really bad pooping could wash men overboard, destroy the steering gear and swamp the ship in a matter of seconds. Having survived the Cape and entered the South Atlantic, the clippers faced the long haul north. The South Atlantic presented its own challenges, particularly the calms of the South Atlantic high-pressure system that sat in the middle of the ocean and could becalm a ship for days in the horse latitudes, the name sailors had given to those zones of high pressure and light variable winds where, legend had it, ships carrying horses to the American colonies had been forced to throw the animals overboard when the water supply ran out. The approach to the equator brought the doldrums again, the same frustrating zone of calms and squalls, and crossing from the South Atlantic to the North Atlantic required skill and patience, and the ability to pick your way through the erratic weather of the intertropical convergence zone. In the North Atlantic, the northwest trade winds offered reliable breezes that could drive a ship northeast toward the English Channel. But the final approach to Britain had its own complications. The Bay of Biscay, which must be crossed to reach the Channel from the south, is notorious for its short, steep seas and its tendency to produce storms of sudden and intense violence that have nothing to do with the general weather pattern of the broader Atlantic. And the English Channel itself, perhaps the busiest and most navigationally complex stretch of water in the world, even in the 19th century, required a different kind of seamanship from the open ocean work of the previous 3 months. Close quarters navigation among other vessels, careful attention to the tides, and the kind of precise local knowledge that was the stock in trade of the Channel pilots, who came out to meet the inbound ships and guide them through the Downs and up the Thames to the docks. The morning of May 29, 1866 began, like most mornings in the China trade, with a great deal of waiting and a great deal of work happening simultaneously. The tea season had been building toward this moment for weeks. The harvest in the Fujian mountains had been good, the first flush leaves picked and withered and fired with the particular care that Foochow tea demanded, the chests packed and sealed and carried down by porters over mountain roads to the river, then loaded onto the flat-bottomed riverboats that brought them downstream to the anchorage where the clippers waited. The loading of a tea clipper was a precise and demanding operation. Tea chests were not simply piled into the hold in whatever arrangement was convenient. The stowage of the cargo affected the trim of the ship, the way she sat in the water and therefore the way she sailed, and a badly trimmed ship could lose significant speed compared to one properly loaded. The holds were packed with mathematical care, chests, wedged and secured to prevent shifting in heavy weather, because a shifting cargo could change the trim of the ship suddenly and dangerously, in conditions where sudden changes of balance were the last thing the captain needed. The weight was distributed to keep the ship slightly by the stern, a fraction deeper at the back than the front, because this was the trim most clipper captains believed gave the best sailing performance in the range of wind and sea conditions they were likely to encounter. Ariel loaded 1,230,900 pounds of tea, an enormous quantity, the result of weeks of careful negotiation and contract, of merchants in London placing orders with their agents in Foochow and the agents booking space on the fastest available ship and paying the premium that the fastest available ship commanded. The merchants knew that they were betting on Ariel. They were betting on Kie, on his skill and his nerve and the quality of the ship under him. The premium they paid for space on the fastest clipper reflected that bet, and they would collect their reward if Ariel won the race, and their tea arrived first. Taeping was loading simultaneously, working through the same night and the same early morning, and the two crews were aware of each other in the way that rival athletes are aware of each other in the corridor before the competition, politely, professionally, with a wariness that had nothing personal about it, but was entirely about what was about to happen. McKinnon on the Taeping had been watching Ariel throughout the loading, calculating, assessing. He knew Key's reputation. He knew the reputation of the ship. He knew also that he had confidence in his own vessel and his own judgment, and he would need both in the days and weeks ahead. Serica, slightly older and perhaps slightly slower, was loading nearby, her captain James Innes going about his business with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows he's probably not the fastest horse in the race but intends to run his own race to the best of his ability regardless. Innes was experienced and capable, and he would need to be. There were also two other ships loading in Foochow that season, Fiery Cross and Taeping, which would also join the race, though they would load and depart on a slightly different schedule and would play supporting roles in the drama rather than starring ones. The tide on the evening of May 29th served at the right hour, and the first ships began to warp out into the stream, using their own boats and capstans and the labour of their crews to move the great hulls into position and then out through the river mouth to the open sea beyond the bar. It was a careful, slow process, conducted in the relative dark of a Chinese coastal night, with the lights of the junks and sampans moving around the larger vessels and the shouts of the pilots carrying across the water. This was the last China would see of these ships for many months, and the sailors who had spent weeks or months in Foochow, bargaining in the markets and eating the local food and perhaps forming attachments of one kind or another in the way that sailors in foreign ports always have, looked back at the lights on the shore as the distance opened between them and felt whatever sailors feel in that moment, relief and anticipation, and perhaps a small cold finger of awareness that the ocean was now in front of them and the land behind. By the morning of May 30th, Ariel and Taeping were at sea. Ariel had gotten away first, though not by a margin that satisfied Kie, who watched the Taeping sails appearing over the horizon behind him with an irritation that he probably expressed through increased demands on his crew, rather than any visible display of emotion. The first priority was southing, getting south of the awkward transition zone between the northeast and southwest monsoons, finding the reliable southeast trades, building speed. Every day of the voyage would matter, every hour might matter, in these years. A race of 90 or 100 days, an advantage measured in hours established on the first week could be the margin that won it. The South China Sea in late May and early June 1866 was not, by the accounts that have survived from logbooks and from the later recollections of officers who made the voyage, a cooperative environment. The monsoon transition was producing the kind of weather that the South China Sea specialises in during the season, patches of dead calm alternating with brief violent squalls that came up with very little warning and required fast reactions from the deck watch if gear was not to be damaged. The skies had the particular quality that experienced tropical sailors recognize as a sign of instability, a hazy brightness that softened the horizon and made distance judgment difficult, broken by the kind of towering cumulus clouds that can develop into squall lines in the space of an hour. Kay was pushing Ariel hard in the early stages as the competitive logic demanded. The first weeks of a China race established the psychological as well as the geographical position. A captain who allowed himself to fall significantly behind in the early stages of a 90-day race had two problems: the practical problem of the distance to make up, and the psychological problem of sailing for weeks in the knowledge that somewhere over the horizon ahead of you, a rival was doing what you should have done but failed to do. The best clipper captains understood that races were won not only by physical speed but by competitive confidence, by the willingness to keep pushing even when the conditions were unfavourable, to refuse to accept that the current circumstances were necessarily permanent. The Taiwan Strait, which the clippers had to pass through on their way south, had its own local weather patterns complicated by the mountains of Taiwan to the east, which created orographic effects that could produce gusty, unpredictable winds quite different from the regional pattern. Kay navigated the strait with care but without excessive caution, the distinction between these two things being the core skill of his profession. You could be cautious enough to protect your ship and your crew and still lose the race. You could be incautious enough to gain time today and lose a mast tomorrow. The correct path was the one that kept the ship moving at maximum sustainable speed, not maximum possible speed, because sustainable and possible were not the same thing, and a captain who confused them ended up dismasted in the South China Sea while his rivals sailed on. By the time Ariel reached the approaches to the Sunda Strait, the early lead she had established was holding but was not large. Taeping was somewhere behind but not far behind, and this was already the shape of the race that would continue for the next 2.5 months. Two ships of approximately equal ability sailed by two captains of approximately equal skill, so closely matched that the result would depend not on any single dramatic event, but on the accumulation of hundreds of small decisions correctly or incorrectly made over the full length of the voyage. The Sunda Strait itself was navigationally interesting in 1866, and the word interesting in this context means something closer to demanding. The strait between Sumatra and Java is about 15 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the tides and currents within it are complex and not fully predictable, affected by the behaviour of the Indian Ocean on the west side and the Java Sea on the east. The volcanic peak of Krakatoa sits in the strait, and the volcanic activity that would culminate in the catastrophic eruption of 1883 was already making itself felt in the form of minor eruptions and the sulphurous smell that hung in the air around the island. Kay sailed past Krakatoa on a morning that, 17 years before the great eruption, would have seemed merely dramatic in its volcanic smokiness, with no indication of the catastrophe that was to come. Through the strait and into the Indian Ocean, Ariel found the southeast trade winds, and they were good winds, consistent and strong enough to drive her at her best speed, close enough to the ideal angle that she could carry full sail without the rig being overstressed. On days like these, a fast clipper was a thing of almost ineffable beauty. The hull cutting clean through the deep blue Indian Ocean water, with a bow wave that crested white and fell away in two long curves. The sails all drawing together, every inch of canvas pulling in harmony, the ship leaning slightly to the pressure of the wind and rising and falling in a smooth rhythmic motion as she rode the long Indian Ocean swell. The rigging humming at a pitch that changed with the wind strength, a deep musical note that permeated the ship from bow to stern. The log spinning behind her, recording 12, 13, 14 knots of speed, numbers that in a favourable stretch could be sustained not just for hours but for days. There is something philosophically unusual about the situation the rival clipper captains found themselves in during the middle weeks of a great race, something that does not have an easy equivalent in other forms of competition. In a horse race or a foot race or a yacht race conducted on a closed course, you can see your rivals at all times. You know exactly where you stand in relation to the competition. In a clipper race across the Indian Ocean, you might sail for 2 weeks without seeing another ship, might have no idea whether the rival you were racing against was 50 miles ahead of you or 50 miles behind, whether the calm patch you had spent 3 frustrating days working through had been avoided by your competitor by virtue of a different track, or whether they had suffered through the same conditions only slightly more efficiently. The logbooks are the record of this strange interior drama, these daily entries that, Recorded position and wind direction and speed and the state of the sails and the condition of the crew, accumulating day by day into the story of a voyage that each captain was living in isolation from the competition they were committed to winning. Kay knew that Taeping existed. He knew approximately where she'd been when last sighted, off the Min River mouth or in the Sunda Strait, and he could calculate roughly where she might be now, based on what he knew of her sailing abilities and his knowledge of the probable wind conditions along her track. But this was calculation, not knowledge, and the uncertainty was a constant companion through the long Indian Ocean days. What happened on those days was interesting precisely because it was not dramatic. The dramatic moments were relatively rare. Most of the 99 days of the 1866 race were ordinary sailing days, days when the captain made his morning observation and worked out the noon position and directed the helmsman to steer a certain course and watched the sails and made small adjustments and ate his meals and read his barometer and went to his bunk when the watch changed and woke again 8 hours later to find the ship more or less where she should be. Routine seamanship, performed to an extremely high standard, sustained over 3 months without significant interruption. The race was won in those ordinary days as much as in the moments of crisis or opportunity. The Indian Ocean in June and July could be magnificently cooperative. The southeast trade winds blew with the kind of regularity that gave them their name, steady and reliable day after day, and a clipper on the right track could make extraordinary runs. The distance from the Sunda Strait to the Cape of Good Hope is roughly 7,000 miles, and a fast clipper averaging 10 knots could cover this in about 30 days, though conditions being what they are, 25 to 35 days was a more realistic range. During this passage, the ships were sailing roughly southwest, then bending their track more to the south as they approached the Cape, aiming to pick up the westerlies of the Southern Ocean at the right latitude. One of the more curious features of the 1866 race was that Ariel and Taeping, despite having left Foochow within hours of each other, and despite being roughly matched in speed, managed to lose sight of each other for extended periods, and only rediscovered each other's proximity when the navigational logic of the route brought them to the same patch of ocean. This happened several times during the voyage. The sighting of a familiar sail on the horizon, followed by the inevitable calculations about relative position and what it meant for the race, and then the slow drama of watching whether the gap was opening or closing, who was moving faster in the current conditions, whether the other ship was carrying more or less sail, and what that implied about her captain's assessment of the weather ahead. Serica, meanwhile, was not far behind. The official race was between Ariel and Taeping in most observers' minds, but Serica was sailing her own strong race, and Captain Innes was not allowing the reputation of the larger ships to discourage him from pushing his vessel as hard as conditions allowed. The fact that Serica would ultimately arrive in London on the same tide as the other two, after 99 days at sea, is a remarkable testament to the closeness of the competition, and to Innes's seamanship over a voyage that required sustained excellence to produce that result. There is a painting that hangs in various forms in maritime museums and private collections, showing a sailing ship in the Southern Ocean south of the Cape of Good Hope. The ship is heeling sharply under press of canvas, her lee rail buried in the foam of a wave that seems impossibly large, the sky above her a chaos of dark cloud and flying spray, the sea around her a wilderness of breaking white caps and enormous swells that recede into a grey distance where sky and water merge without a clear horizon. It is both beautiful and terrifying, and it captures something true about what sailing in those waters is like, though no painting can fully convey the cold, or the noise, or the particular quality of exhausted dread that comes from being wet through for the third day in a row with no prospect of drying out before you reach the Atlantic. Kay would have taken Ariel below 40 degrees south to find the strongest westerlies. This was the standard practice for a captain racing home in the southern winter months, June and July, when the westerlies were at their most consistent and strongest. The risk was ice. South of 45 degrees, and sometimes as far north as 40 in bad years, drifting icebergs were a genuine hazard. Great white cliffs of frozen freshwater carved from the Antarctic ice sheet and carried north by the currents, difficult to see in poor visibility and often surrounded by smaller growlers, chunks of dense ice barely showing above the waterline, which could hole a ship without the kind of warning that a full-sized berg might provide. The decision about exactly how far south to go was one of the most consequential tactical decisions of the entire voyage. Too far north and you might miss the strongest winds and add days to your passage. Too far south and you risked ice. The experienced captains had developed rules of thumb built on years of observation and the accumulated wisdom of the sailing community, passed on through conversation and the navigation guides that were updated with each new season's observations. But ultimately each captain had to make his own judgment call in his own conditions with his own ship, and the consequences of getting it wrong fell on him and his crew and his cargo. The Cape itself was rounded without catastrophe by Ariel, which seems to have found reasonably good conditions for that passage, the logs recording strong westerly, winds and significant seas, but nothing that amounted to a survival situation. Taeping came around the Cape in similar conditions, and the two ships entered the South Atlantic having changed their relative positions at least once during the Indian Ocean crossing, so that the question of who was ahead remained genuinely open. A clipper ship rounding the Cape in winter was a vessel being tested in every dimension simultaneously, the hull working as the great swells lifted her and set her down, the timbers flexing and the caulking being asked to maintain its seal under stresses that would have opened up a less well-built vessel, the rigging under constant load from the strong winds, every wire and every rope bearing its share of the enormous forces generated by acres of canvas driving a 700-ton hull through a confused sea, the steering requiring constant attention and constant correction as the ship surged and yawed, and the helmsman fought to maintain the course that kept her, running rather than broaching, turning sideways to the seas in a potentially catastrophic loss of control. There were ships lost on the Cape run in those years. Not in 1866, not the ships we are following, but the graveyard of the Southern Ocean was not empty, and the captains who successfully navigated it season after season were men who combined skill and knowledge with a careful attention to the moment when the risk of pressing on became greater than the cost of slowing down. That moment arrived occasionally in conditions that even the bravest captain had to acknowledge as beyond the ability of any ship to survive at full speed, and the decision to reduce sail and heave to and wait for the worst to pass was not cowardice, but the exercise of the judgment that kept ships and men alive to sail another day. Having rounded the Cape and entered the South Atlantic, the clippers faced the longest unbroken stretch of the homeward passage, the haul north from the latitude of the Cape to the latitude of the English Channel, a distance of roughly 8,000 miles through conditions that changed character dramatically as they progressed. The South Atlantic initially offered more of the westerlies that had driven them around the Cape, though with diminishing strength as they moved north and the latitude decreased. Then came the zone of the South Atlantic High, that persistent area of high pressure centered around latitude 30 south and longitude 15 west that had been the nemesis of sailing ships since the age of exploration. Here the winds were light and variable and sometimes simply absent, and a ship caught in the center of the high could sit for days with barely enough wind to keep steerage way, the sails slatting emptily in a faint swell, the crew restless and the captain doing mathematics in his head and finding the results unsatisfying. The horse latitudes, as they were known, required patience that the competitive captain found almost physically painful to exercise. There was nothing to do but wait, to sail whatever angle the light airs provided, to watch the barometer and look at the clouds and hope that the edge of the high was close and that the trade winds on the other side of it were reliable and strong. Some captains handled this period by driving their crews to work on ship maintenance, the constant round of repairs and painting and rigging work that a long voyage always generated, keeping busy minds and idle hands occupied. Others retreated to their cabins and their charts and their calculations, planning their track through the remaining miles with a precision that was partly useful and partly an exercise in preserving sanity. Key, as he pushed Ariel north through the South Atlantic, was carrying in his head the knowledge that Taeping was somewhere nearby, that the gap between them might be as small as a few hours, that every decision he made was being mirrored or countered by a captain of equal ability on a ship of equal quality, and that the margin between winning and losing this race had probably already been established by a dozen small advantages or disadvantages that would only become apparent when both ships arrived in London. He could not know, sailing through the South Atlantic in July of 1866, that the finish of the race would be so close as to seem almost impossible, that after 99 days and 16,000 miles, the margin between first and second place would be a matter of minutes. What he could do was sail. Sail carefully, sail intelligently, sail with the full application of everything he knew about his ship and the ocean and the weather, and trust that this would be enough. The clipper captain's version of faith was not theological but practical. Faith in the ship, in the rigging, in the crew, in the accumulated experience that told him how to extract the last fraction of a knot from every wind condition he encountered. Faith that the choices he made, the course corrections and sail trim adjustments and strategic decisions about where to seek the wind were collectively better than the choices being made on the rival ship somewhere over the horizon. As August arrived and the ships moved into the North Atlantic, the conditions changed again. The northeast trade winds offered reliable northward progress, the kind of steady pushing that allowed a well-sailed clipper to build up a run of good days, noon position after noon position, showing the miles accumulating at a satisfying rate. The crews began to feel it, the change in the air that came as the ship moved into northern latitudes, the gradual cooling, the different quality of the light, the first sight perhaps of a gannet or a booby riding the wind that suggested the proximity of land that might still be a week away, but was no longer an abstraction. The Bay of Biscay, as ever, refused to offer easy passage. A typical pattern in late August would see a period of strong southwesterly winds as a depression, tracked across the bay, generating a short, steep sea that gave the heavily laden clippers a rough passage and tested the security of the stowed cargo. Then perhaps a spell of calmer weather, or alternatively another depression following the first in the endless procession of Atlantic weather systems that marched across these latitudes through the summer and autumn and winter. Kay pressed on regardless, making whatever speed conditions permitted, watching the barometer and the sky and the log spinner counting the remaining miles. On the evening of September the 5th, 1866, a signal rocket went up from the cliffs above the Lizard Peninsula, the southernmost point of the British mainland, announcing the arrival of the first tea clipper of the season. The Lizard had a signal station that communicated with Lloyd's of London, the great insurance market, and through Lloyd's with the merchant community that was waiting with varying degrees of anxiety for news of the ships they had chartered and the tea they had ordered. The signal meant that a clipper had been sighted off the Lizard, and the race to the telegraph office in Falmouth that would carry the news to London began. The ship sighted was Taeping, but only barely. Ariel had been sighted off the Lizard within half an hour of Taeping, and both ships, having sailed simultaneously into the channel approaches after 99 days at sea, were now in a final sprint up the channel to the Thames that would compress 3 months of accumulated advantage or disadvantage into a single breathtaking afternoon. This last stretch of the race brought in a new element, the channel pilot. Pilots came out from Falmouth and from other channel ports in swift pilot cutters, small fast-sailing vessels crewed by men who made their living by meeting inbound ships and guiding them through the tidal complexities of the approaches to the Thames. A good pilot, one who knew the tides and the shoals and the right moment to catch a favourable stream, could make a significant difference to a ship's passage time through the channel. A bad one, or simply a less experienced one, could cost hours. Both Ariel and Taeping picked up pilots, and the quality of the pilotage in the final hours of the race may have mattered almost as much as everything that had gone before. The two ships worked up the channel with the flood tide, racing each other now in plain sight for the first time since the Min River mouth 99 days earlier. Key on Ariel, McKinnon on Taeping, each pressing his ship for every fraction of a knot. The crews exhausted from 3 months at sea, but galvanized by the proximity of land and the knowledge that the prize they had been working toward for all those weeks was now a matter of miles rather than thousands of miles away. Serica was not far behind them, though she had lost ground somewhere in the channel approaches and could see that the leading two ships were pulling away in the final hours. What happened next has been told and retold so many times in maritime history that it has acquired something of the quality of legend, which is appropriate because the events were genuinely legendary. Ariel crossed the line first at Gravesend, reaching her pilot station and completing the official timing of the race at approximately 8:30 in the morning of September 6th, 1866, 99 days, 21 hours and 14 minutes after leaving Foochow. Taeping crossed 10 minutes later. In a race of 99 days covering 16,000 miles of ocean, two ships arrived within 10 minutes of each other. Serica arrived the same day, several hours behind the leaders, but still on the same tide, which meant that technically all three ships arrived on the same London tide and could claim equal prize under certain interpretations of the bonuses offered by the tea merchants. The actual division of the prize money was decided with Solomonic wisdom, the lead merchants splitting the purchase, premium between Ariel and Taeping on the grounds that neither could fairly claim sole victory over the other, and extending a smaller recognition to Serica for her remarkable performance. Kay protested, reasonably enough, that his ship had been first past the post and that the prize was his. Mackinnon was characteristically quieter about the whole thing. The newspapers were not quiet. The coverage of the 1866 tea race was extraordinary by the standards of Victorian journalism, which was already quite good at generating excitement around competitive maritime events. The Times, the Illustrated London News, and dozens of provincial papers ran detailed accounts of the race, and extensive commentary on the result, the seamanship involved, and the remarkable coincidence that had brought these ships to London within minutes of each other, after 3 months of independent navigation across the breadth of the world's oceans. For a public that did not yet have cinema or radio or television, for whom the great sporting events were horse racing and cricket, and the occasional celebrated prize fight, the tea race offered something that those sports could not: global scope, genuine danger, and the satisfying narrative of human skill and determination tested against the largest and most indifferent arena imaginable. The merchants who had bet on Ariel felt, with some justice, that they had been cheated of the full value of their gamble by the compromise settlement. The merchants who had backed Taeping felt, with equal justice, that their ship had arrived on the same tide and deserved equal recognition. And in the pub and coffee-house conversations that followed, and in the column inches of maritime journalism that the race generated, the question of who had truly won became one of those pleasantly unresolvable arguments that the British public has always enjoyed far more than a clear and unambiguous result would have allowed. The 1866 race was extraordinary, but it was not the end of the story. If anything, it was a kind of climax that set the scene for the final act, the act in which the clipper ship reached its absolute physical pinnacle and simultaneously began to confront the technology that would render it obsolete. That act starred 2 ships whose names, more than any others, have come to define the clipper era in the public imagination. The Thermopylae, launched in 1868 from Hood's Yard in Aberdeen, and the Cutty Sark, launched in 1869 from the yard of Scott and Linton at Dumbarton. Between these 2 ships, the final chapter of the great tea races would be written, and in one of them the spirit of the whole era would survive, precariously, into the present day. The Thermopylae was commissioned by George Thompson Jr. of the Aberdeen White Star Line, not to be confused with the better-known White Star Line of Atlantic passenger shipping. Thompson was a man who had grown up in the trade and had watched the racing of the previous decade with the particular intensity of someone who understood both the commercial value and the aesthetic pleasure of a fast ship. He wanted the fastest ship ever built, and he was prepared to pay for it. The result was Thermopylae, 212 feet in length with a beam of 36 feet, built of composite construction to the highest standards that the Aberdeen yards could achieve, and she was launched into the Aberdeen harbour with the kind of ceremony that was reserved for vessels expected to become famous. She justified the ceremony almost immediately. On her maiden voyage to Melbourne in 1868, Thermopylae set records that caused genuine astonishment in the sailing community. 60 days from London to Melbourne, 63 days home, both times beating any previous sailing ship passage. Then on to China for her first tea voyage, and again records. Passages that were not merely fast, but emphatically, demonstrably, mathematically superior to what other ships of comparable size were achieving. Thermopylae had a quality that is difficult to analyse, but was immediately apparent to anyone who saw her under full sail. A kind of effortless speed, a flowing movement through the water that suggested she was doing less work than she was, that the sea was yielding to her rather than being forced aside. Part of this quality came from her hull form, which was refined beyond any previous clipper in its underwater lines. Part came from the quality of her construction, which was superb by the standards of the day. And part came from the quality of her captains, the most celebrated of whom was Richard Kemble, who commanded her in the early years, and later Captain Richard Woolwich, but most of all from Henry Shewan, who sailed her through much of her racing career and who was, by the consensus of those who sailed with him and against him, one of the 2 or 3 finest clipper captains of the era. The Thermopylae quickly acquired a reputation for being not merely fast, but somehow lucky, for being a ship that found good winds where other ships found calms, that threaded through bad weather systems that damaged or delayed her rivals, that seemed to have some mysterious affinity with the conditions of the ocean that went beyond mere engineering. This kind of reputation is always partly earned and partly mythology, the attribution of personality and fortune to what is in reality the result of consistent good seamanship and a good hull. But mythology attaches to great ships as it attaches to great people, and the mythology of the Thermopylae was largely favourable and mostly deserved. What the Thermopylae needed, in the way that great champions always need a worthy rival, was another ship that could actually challenge her. The merchants and owners and builders who had been watching her performances from the sidelines recognised this need and began to plan their response. The man who responded most directly was John Willis, a London ship owner known universally in the trade as Old White Hat for the distinctive headgear that was his sartorial trademark. Willis was not a sentimental man about ships. He was a businessman who understood the economics of the tea trade precisely, and he understood that the commercial premium for the fastest ship was large enough to justify the considerable expense of building a vessel specifically intended to challenge and defeat the Thermopylae. He contracted with the firm of Scott and Linton at Dumbarton to build him a ship that would be the fastest clipper ever constructed, and he was prepared to drive the specifications to the very limit of what was physically achievable. The ship Scott and Linton designed for him was the Cutty Sark, and her story is inseparable from the broader story of the clipper era in a way that is partly due to her own qualities and partly due to the remarkable accident of her survival. The name Cutty Sark comes from Robert Burns's poem Tam O'Shanter, published in 1790, in which Tam, a Scottish farmer returning home somewhat worse for wear from an evening at the pub, is chased by a witch named Nanny, who is wearing nothing but a short linen shirt, a cutty sark in the Scots dialect. The image of Nanny in her cutty sark, arms outstretched and hair flying, became the figurehead of the ship, a gilded female figure leaning forward from the bow as if reaching for the horizon, and it gave the Cutty Sark both her name and her most potent visual symbol. She was launched on November 22nd, 1869, and she was beautiful in the way that great fighting machines sometimes achieve beauty, a beauty that comes not from ornamentation, but from the absolute efficiency of every line and surface in the service of a single purpose. She was 212 feet in length, virtually identical to Thermopylae, with a beam of 36 feet and a depth of 21 feet. Her composite hull was built to the most exacting standards, iron frames with teak planking, every timber and every frame fitted and fastened with the precision that the Dumbarton builders brought to their work. Her rigging was designed to carry an enormous spread of canvas, and she was given a system of lower masts and bowsprit designed for maximum stiffness under load, because the speed of a clipper depended not just on the area of canvas she could carry, but on the rigidity of the structure that held it in place. Her first captain was George Moody, a Scot of considerable experience who had sailed the China run before, and who brought to the command of the Cutty Sark the same combination of ambition and caution that the job required. He had high expectations for his ship, and the tea merchants who had backed Willis in building her had even higher ones. The Cutty Sark was going to China to beat Thermopylae, and everyone knew it, and the pressure on Moody and on the ship and on the men who had put their money and their reputations into her was considerable from the moment she cleared the Clyde. The direct rivalry between Cutty Sark and Thermopylae is one of the great sporting rivalries of the Victorian era, and it is the more remarkable for having produced a clean result in only one significant direct contest, a result that was itself ambiguous. In the tea race of 1872, the two ships left Shanghai within hours of each other and proceeded down the China coast in conditions that were sometimes close enough to allow them to observe each other's progress directly. For weeks they sailed within sight of each other, or within a day's sailing, and the contest between them was watched by the entire maritime world with an intensity that the 1866 race had established as the appropriate emotional register for such events. Then, disaster struck the Cutty Sark. In the South Atlantic, in bad weather, the rudder was damaged in a manner that made it impossible to steer the ship properly. This was the kind of catastrophe that could have ended the voyage entirely, that in some ships would have forced a diversion to the nearest port for repairs that might take weeks. Moody's response, and the response of his crew, was the kind of improvised seamanship that the clipper era produced at its best. They rigged a jury rudder, a makeshift replacement constructed from spare materials on board, a solution that was adequate rather than elegant but that allowed the ship to continue. This jury rudder would never give the same control as the original, and the additional drag it created cost speed, and in the end Thermopylae arrived in London first by a week and a day. The result was counted as a victory for Thermopylae, and the partisans of that ship celebrated accordingly. but the partisans of the Cutty Sark argued with considerable force that the result reflected the disaster of the rudder rather than any fundamental superiority of the Thermopylae, and that in a fair contest without the handicap of a damaged rudder, the Cutty Sark would have won. This argument has never been definitively resolved, which is of course part of why it has continued to be made for 150 years. On November 17, 1869, the same year the Cutty Sark was launched on the Clyde. A ceremony took place in Egypt that would do more damage to the tea clipper trade than any storm or rival ship or commercial misfortune. The Suez Canal was formally opened by the Empress Eugenie of France aboard the imperial yacht, in a ceremony that involved a flotilla of ships, a great deal of ceremony, and the accumulated diplomatic effort of decades of negotiation and construction. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who had driven the project, watched the ships pass through the canal that his vision and his persistence had made possible, and he was entitled to his satisfaction, because the canal was a genuine engineering marvel, 100 miles of artificial waterway cut through the Egyptian desert to connect the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. For steamships, the Suez Canal was transformative. A steamer travelling from London to Bombay that had previously been forced to go around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles to the voyage, could now pass through the canal and reduce the distance dramatically. The passage from London to China, which by the Cape route was 16,000 miles or more, was reduced to less than 12,000 miles through Suez. For a steamship burning coal at a fixed rate, this was an almost unimaginable improvement in economics. For a sailing ship, it meant almost nothing. The problem was that the Suez Canal could not be used by sailing ships under most conditions. The canal was too narrow, the winds too variable, and the current issues too complex to allow a large sailing vessel to navigate it without the kind of engine assistance that the canal's operators provided to steamships. A sailing clipper would have needed to be towed through the entire 100 miles of the canal, at a cost in time and money that largely negated the distance advantage. The great clippers, those magnificent instruments of wind-powered speed, were excluded from the shortcut by the very characteristic that made them fast everywhere else. The commercial consequences were immediate and brutal. The tea trade, which had been the primary revenue source for the great clippers, began rapidly shifting to steamships after the canal opened. Steam was still less economical than sail over very long distances in favourable winds, but the Suez route was simply so much shorter for steam that the economics changed overnight. By the early 1870s, the majority of the new season tea was coming home on steamships through the canal, and the premiums that had made the clipper race worth winning were beginning to shrink because the steamships, though not as fast as the fastest clippers in ideal conditions, were reliable in a way that wind-driven ships could never be. A steamer left on a schedule and arrived approximately on schedule. A clipper left when the tide served and arrived when the wind allowed. The merchants who had been paying premiums for speed on clippers discovered that a steamer arriving on a predictable schedule in 35 days through Suez was commercially more valuable than a clipper arriving anywhere between 65 and 110 days depending on the weather. The unpredictability of sail, which had been tolerable when there was no alternative, became intolerable the moment an alternative existed. The tea merchants did not abandon the clippers with any pleasure, many of them. They had grown up in the trade and they appreciated the beauty and the tradition and the extraordinary achievement that a record tea passage represented. But they were businessmen, and the business logic was clear and unambiguous, and they followed it. The clippers found their response in two directions. Some of them took whatever. China trade remained, competing with each other for a diminishing pool of cargo that could not be accommodated on the early steamships. Others, most notably including the Cutty Sark in her greatest commercial period, turned to the Australian wool trade, where the route around the Cape was still necessary even for steamships since the Suez Canal offered no advantage for ships going to or from Australia, and where the combination of enormous distances, reliable winds in the southern hemisphere, and bulky cargo suited the clippers' particular talents. The story of the Cutty Sark did not end with the decline of the tea trade, though for some years in the late 1870s and early 1880s, under a series of captains who were competent but not exceptional, her performance was unremarkable and her commercial position was difficult. John Willis was not an easy man to work for, and the relationship between owner and ship became increasingly strained as the economics of the trade made profitable, voyages harder to achieve, and Willis's demands remained unchanged from the era when the China trade had been lucrative. Then in 1885, Richard Woodgett took command, and everything changed. Woodgett was 40 years old when he took the Cutty Sark, a Norfolk man who had gone to sea young and worked his way up through the merchant service with the steady accumulation of experience and skill that the profession rewarded. He was not a spectacular figure in the mould of the most celebrated clipper captains, not given to the kind of public pronouncements and colourful anecdotes that made men like Kie famous. He was something perhaps more valuable, a captain of extraordinary practical skill and competitive intelligence, who brought to the command of the Cutty Sark a devotion to speed that matched anything the ship had experienced in the China trade. Under Woodgett, the Cutty Sark became the fastest ship on the Australian wool run, setting records that remain outstanding to this day. The wool trade, from Australia to England, was a race in its own right, less formally organised than the tea races but no less competitive in practice, with the wool merchants preferring the first bales to arrive and paying accordingly. Woodgett pushed the Cutty Sark through the Southern Ocean with an aggression that was remarkable even by the standards of the wool run, sailing further south than most captains dared, seeking the strongest westerlies at latitudes where the ice was a genuine hazard and the weather was consistently brutal, trading safety margin for speed in a way that worked, because Woodgett's judgment was superb. His fastest passages on the wool run were genuinely astonishing. In 1887 he made the passage from Sydney to London in 72 days, the fastest ever recorded for a sailing ship on that route at that time. In subsequent years he repeatedly made passages under 80 days, times that put the Cutty Sark in a class entirely by herself on the Australian run, and confirmed her reputation as the fastest merchant sailing ship in the world. During this period she regularly beat not only every other sailing ship but also the steamships on the same route, a feat that was already becoming the kind of benchmark that could define a ship's legacy. The crews who sailed with Woodgett were worked extremely hard. The Cutty Sark's accommodation for ordinary seamen was no better than any other ship of the period, which is to say it was cold and damp and cramped, and Woodgett drove his men with the same intensity he brought to driving his ship. But by most accounts the crews were proud to serve on her, proud of the records and the reputation, proud of being associated with something that was visibly extraordinary. The Cutty Sark under Woodgett was a machine operating at its absolute limit, and the men who kept her running at that limit were part of something larger than any individual voyage. Thermopylae during this same period was sailing the Australian run on behalf of a different owner and was still competitive, still fast, still a great ship by any measure, but the direct rivalry between the two ships on the wool run produced a result that was much clearer than their inconclusive contest on the China run. Over multiple seasons, over multiple passages measured and compared, the Cutty Sark was consistently faster. Not by enormous margins, not in every individual comparison, but consistently, reliably, measurably. The ship that Burns's poem had named for a scandalously short shift was, by the consensus of the maritime world, the faster of the two great rivals. This does not mean that Thermopylae was a lesser achievement. A ship that loses a close contest to the Cutty Sark loses to the best there ever was, and Thermopylae's record over her career is one of the finest in the history of commercial sail. But the Cutty Sark needed a clear victory, something unambiguous to set against the 1872 race and its asterisk of the damaged rudder, and the wool run provided it. The stories of the great tea clippers after their racing days are various and mostly melancholy, in the way that the stories of great athletes in decline often are. The world they had been built for was changing faster than they could adapt, and the economics of sail were becoming progressively more difficult as steam became progressively more efficient, and the network of coaling stations around the world made steam power available in ports that had previously been accessible only to sailing ships. Ariel, the ship that had crossed the line at Gravesend first in the Great Race of 1866, was lost at sea in 1872, 6 years after her greatest triumph. She vanished on a voyage from London to Sydney, presumably in the same Southern Ocean waters that she had navigated so brilliantly during the racing years, and her loss was complete. No survivors, no wreckage found, no explanation ever established. She simply did not arrive. The sea that had been the stage for her glory was also the instrument of her ending. Taeping, her great rival of 1866, fared little better. She was wrecked on Ladd's Reef in the South China Sea in 1871, 5 years after the race, ending her days on the same waters she had navigated so brilliantly in her prime. The wreck was a rapid one, the ship striking in conditions that did not allow for salvage, and what remained of her was taken by the sea and the years in the way of wooden ships that find their final anchorage on a reef rather than in a harbour. Serica, the third of the great trio of 1866, lasted somewhat longer, continuing in the trade through the 1870s, before being sold out of the tea run and converted to other purposes, eventually ending her life as a hulk in less distinguished employment, one of those endings that feels ungrateful given what the ship had been in her prime. Thermopylae survived somewhat longer, being sold to the Portuguese Navy in 1895 and serving for some years as a training ship under the name Pedro Nunes. Her end came in 1907, when she was used by the Portuguese Navy as a target for torpedo practice and sunk off the coast of Portugal. The great ship that had once been the wonder of the maritime world went down in shallow water with whatever ceremony a torpedo provides, and what the sea did not take, the Portuguese salvaged, and what remained was eventually covered by silt and sand and is now presumably still there. The bones of a great ship under the Atlantic. The Cutty Sark alone survived, and her survival is itself a remarkable story, involving multiple changes of ownership, multiple repurposings, a period of working in the Portuguese wine trade under a different name, the intervention of a retired sea captain who bought her almost on a whim and saved her from the fate of most old ships, the gradual recognition of what she represented to the maritime heritage of Britain, and finally her arrival in permanent dry dock at Greenwich in 1954, where she sits today as one of the most visited ship museums in the world. Her survival was not inevitable, and it was not straightforward. She was sold by John Willis in 1895, the year after Woodgett left her command, to a Portuguese firm that renamed her Ferreira and put her in the wine trade between Portugal and Brazil, a dignified enough employment, but one that did nothing to preserve the memory of her racing days. She sailed as Ferreira for 27 years, through the First World War and its hazards, carrying wine where she'd once carried tea and wool. Her original name known only to those with long memories and access to old shipping records. Then, in 1922, a retired British sea captain named Wilfred Dowman, who had seen the Cutty Sark under sail as a young man and never forgotten her, encountered her in Falmouth Harbour and recognised her despite the different name and the changes that decades of working life had made to her appearance. He bought her, restored her as nearly as possible to her original rig and appearance, and used her as a training ship at Falmouth for several years before his death. His widow continued the work, eventually donating the ship to the Thames Nautical Training College, and she was used as a training ship on the Thames until her permanent dry docking at Greenwich in 1954. A fire in 2007 caused significant damage and required major restoration work that was completed in 2012, and she now stands, preserved and restored, as a monument to the age that built her. There is something about the tea clippers that has maintained a hold on the imagination that other equally significant technological achievements of the Victorian era have not always managed to match. We do not build museums to Victorian steam engines with the same fervour. We do not celebrate the great railway locomotives of the 1860s with quite the same romantic intensity, even though those machines transformed daily life in ways that the tea clippers, by comparison, did not. The clipper ship occupied a different place, in the cultural imagination, and understanding why tells us something interesting about what people value and what they choose to remember. Part of it is the visual quality of the clipper. A great sailing ship under full canvas is one of the most beautiful man-made objects ever created, and it is beautiful in a way that photographs and paintings can convey with a directness that the beauty of an engine or a locomotive cannot quite achieve. The image of a tall ship running before a strong breeze in blue water, every sail drawing and the bow cutting a clean white wave, is an image that bypasses intellectual analysis and goes straight to something more primitive, something that recognises in the combination of human craft and natural force a kind of perfection that is both made and discovered simultaneously. Part of it is the human scale of the achievement. The clipper ship was driven by wind, a natural force, managed by human skill. The engineering involved was extraordinary, but it was engineering expressed in materials and forms that a non-specialist can appreciate without needing to understand the technical details. You do not need to know anything about naval architecture or rigging theory to feel that a clipper ship is beautiful and fast. The beauty and the speed are available to anyone who looks. But perhaps more than the visual quality or the human scale, what has kept the tea clippers alive in popular imagination is the story. the story of the races, of the captains and the competition, and the extraordinary coincidence of the 1866 finish, of the Cutty Sark's rivalry with Thermopylae, and the ambiguous result of the 1872 contest, of the long decline from glory to working ship to training ship to museum, is a story that has all the elements that make stories memorable. Competition, risk, extraordinary human skill tested against extraordinary natural forces, a kind of glory that is transient and therefore precious, and an ending that is melancholy in the loss of the ships and the world they represented, but not entirely sad, because the best of them survived and stands in Greenwich to this day. The Victorian public understood that they were watching something exceptional during the years of the Great China races. The newspaper coverage, the betting on results, the detailed reporting of passage times and wind conditions that the shipping press provided, all of this reflected a genuine public engagement with the races that was not manufactured by the press but rather responded to by it, the press reporting what people were already interested in, extending and elaborating a curiosity that was already there. The ships had become characters in a drama that played out over months, and that was followed by the kind of attentive audience that would in later centuries follow sporting events or television serials, an audience that invested emotionally in outcomes and that remembered results and argued about them. This engagement persisted after the races were over, after the ships themselves had been sold or wrecked or repurposed, in the literature and art and memory of the maritime world. Herman Melville, writing about ships and the sea in the same decades, captured some of the same quality, the feeling that the great sailing ship represented something irreplaceable that was being lost to the march of steam and steel and rational commercial calculation. The romanticisation of the clipper began almost before the clipper's useful working life was over, which is unusual and suggests that the people of that era understood at some level that what they were watching was not merely a successful commercial innovation, but an aesthetic and human achievement that would not be repeated. The tea clipper era was not only romantically significant, it was scientifically and technologically significant in ways that had lasting consequences for naval architecture and hydrodynamics, the science of how objects move through water. The competitive pressure of the China races drove ship designers to investigate questions about hull form and resistance and stability that had previously been matters of practical experience and intuition rather than systematic inquiry. And the results of this investigation fed into later ship design in ways that are still traceable in the hulls of modern sailing yachts, and in the theoretical understanding of how water behaves around moving bodies. Matthew Fontaine Maury, the American naval officer and oceanographer who spent much of his career at the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, made a contribution to the tea clipper era that is often overlooked but was crucial. Maury had spent years collecting data from the logbooks of naval vessels and merchant ships, building up a database of wind and current observations from across the world's oceans that allowed him to construct the first systematic wind and current charts for ocean navigation. His Physical Geography of the Sea, published in 1855, gave ship captains access to statistical knowledge about the likely wind conditions on any given route at any given time of year, allowing them to plan their tracks with a precision that had previously been impossible. The clipper captains who used Maury's charts were able to take advantage of favourable winds and avoid unfavourable ones with a reliability that represented a significant improvement over navigation by local knowledge and gut instinct alone. They could plan a track across the Indian Ocean that was statistically likely to find the southeast trade winds in their most favourable position, or time their departure from China to catch the monsoon transition in the way most advantageous for their first week at sea. This was not deterministic. The weather remained unpredictable at the level of individual days and individual storms, but the statistical improvement in average passage times that Maury's charts enabled was measurable and significant. The hull form experiments, conducted by the British Admiralty and by Lloyd's in the 1860s and 1870s in response to the competitive pressures of the tea trade, contributed to the development of systematic towing tank testing as a tool for hull design evaluation, a methodology that remains central to ship design today. The towing tank, a long water-filled channel in which scale models could be dragged at controlled speeds while the resistance was measured, allowed designers to compare different hull forms objectively and to iterate towards shapes that minimized resistance at the speeds where the ships would be operating. This seems obvious in retrospect, but it represented a fundamental shift from the tradition of empirical design, designing ships based on what experience suggested worked, to a more scientific approach based on systematic measurement and comparison. The rigging experiments that clipper designers and captains conducted, the various modifications to mast positions, sail plans, and standing rigging arrangements contributed to an understanding of sail aerodynamics that was equally important for later yacht design. The question of how a sail generates force, how the shape of the sail in the wind affects the power it generates and the direction of that power was being worked out empirically on the hulls of the tea clippers at the same time as it was beginning to be investigated theoretically, and the practical knowledge accumulated in the racing years fed directly into the scientific work that followed. The composite hull construction technique developed for the tea clippers, iron framing with wooden planking, was the direct ancestor of the ferro-cement and fibre-reinforced composite hull construction techniques that are now standard in yacht building. The principle of separating the structural function provided by the frame from the hydrodynamic function provided by the planking and using different materials optimized for each function is still the governing philosophy of high-performance hull construction, expressed now in carbon fibre and aerospace adhesives rather than wrought iron and teak, but recognisably continuous with what the Greenock and Aberdeen shipyards were doing in the 1860s. We have talked a great deal about the ships and the captains, but the tea races were ultimately funded by merchants, and the merchants were ultimately motivated by money, and the money was embedded in a broader commercial and imperial system that shaped every aspect of the trade from the mountain slopes of Fujian to the breakfast tables of Kensington. To understand the races fully, you need to understand the economics, and to understand the economics you need to understand something about the structure of the Victorian tea trade that is not always part of the romantic story. The premium paid for the first new season tea to arrive in London was not simply a reflection of quality, though quality was genuinely higher for early season tea. It was also partly a reflection of marketing, of the cachet attached to being the merchant who could advertise to his customers that their tea had come on the first clipper, that the blend they were drinking had been grown and fired and packed and shipped with such speed and care that it had arrived in London before the season was properly established. This kind of premium was, in the language of modern marketing, a brand differentiator, a way for one merchant to distinguish his offering from another's in a market where the underlying product was in many ways similar. The firms that dominated the London tea trade in the 1860s were mostly well-established family businesses with roots in the East India Company era, men who had made their money in the monopoly period and were now adapting to the competitive market with varying degrees of success. Jardine Matheson and Company, with its deep roots in the China trade and its headquarters in Hong Kong, was involved in chartering and sometimes owning clippers through the racing years. So was Butterfield and Swire and other major Hong, as the foreign trading houses in China were known. The premium system that drove the races was maintained by the collective willingness of these firms and their clients to pay more for earlier tea, a willingness that was both rational, because earlier tea was genuinely better, and social, because the ability to offer the first of season tea was a commercial and social marker of importance in the London merchant community. The underwriters at Lloyd's of London also had a significant stake in the clipper trade, insuring both the ships and their cargoes on the China run and pricing their premiums on the basis of the risks they assessed. A fully laden clipper carrying £1 million of tea was insured for a sum that would have seemed fantastic by the standards of everyday Victorian commerce, and the loss of such a ship, like the loss of Ariel in 1872, represented a substantial claim against the underwriters. Lloyd's had been managing maritime insurance since the 17th century and had developed sophisticated methods for assessing and pricing risk, and their assessments of the relative risks of different ships and different routes influenced the commercial decisions of the merchants and owners in ways that are difficult to disentangle from the purely nautical story. The global context of the tea trade also included the producers, the farmers and workers in the Fujian Mountains and the other tea-growing regions of China, who grew the leaves that filled the chests, that filled the holds, that drove the competition that built the ships. These people are almost entirely absent from the historical record of the tea races, which is characteristic of how the historical record of empire works, documenting the activities of the powerful and the commercially significant while leaving the producers and workers who made those activities possible in relative invisibility. What we know is that the tea-growing industry in Fujian was organised by a complex system of factors and middlemen who bought the tea from the growers and sold it to the export merchants, and that the prices paid to the growers were determined by market forces that they had little ability to influence and that the extraordinary premiums paid by London merchants for the first of season tea did not translate into equivalent premiums for the people who had grown it. One of the pleasures and frustrations of researching the tea clipper era is the relative scarcity of personal documents from the captains themselves. The logbooks survive, meticulous daily records of position and wind and weather and sail trim. But these are professional documents rather than personal ones, written in the formal language of maritime record-keeping rather than in the voice of the man who wrote them. Letters are less common, and personal diaries rarer still, and the result is that the captains of the great racing clippers are often more present in the records of others than in their own words. What survives, however, is illuminating. The logbooks, read carefully, reveal personality in the gaps and choices rather than an explicit statement. Key's logs from the 1866 voyage, the fragments that have survived, show a man who was precise in his technical observations and sparing with his emotional ones, who noted a significant squall or a change of wind with the same economy of language as a routine course correction, who expressed nothing that could be called anxiety or excitement about the race, even as the entries accumulated day by day toward the extraordinary finish. This suppression of personal emotion in the professional record is characteristic of the period and the profession, but it also tells us something about the culture, the expectation that a captain would keep his feelings to himself and be judged by his results, rather than by his account of his feelings about them. The few personal letters that have survived from the clipper captains are mostly written to family members, wives or parents or siblings, from port before departure or after arrival, and they are characterized by the same economy that the logbooks show. Brief reassurances of health and safety, brief accounts of the voyage just completed or anticipated, and then the pragmatic concerns of a man who has limited time in port before the next departure. John Kay, in a letter, written to his wife from London after the 1866 race, apparently expressed his satisfaction with the result and his frustration with the prize money decision in terms that were measured and restrained, whatever burning competitive feelings he had suppressed into a professionalism that would have struck most 21st century readers as almost inhuman in its self-control. The contrast between this public restraint and the private competitive obsession that must have driven men like Kay is one of the interesting psychological puzzles of the clipper era. These were not men who were indifferent to the races. The evidence is too strong that they cared intensely, that they pushed their ships and their crews to extremes that would not have been justified by pure commercial calculation, that the competitive element had grown into something larger than the commercial element, and was driving decisions that were not always in the strict financial interest of the ship or the cargo. They were obsessed. But they expressed their obsession through action rather than words, through the relentless application of skill in service of speed, rather than through the kind of public declaration of competitive intent that modern sports culture makes normal. Captain Richard Woodgett, who produced the Cutty Sark's greatest wool run performances in the late 1880s, was somewhat more forthcoming in the personal records he left behind, partly because he came from a slightly later generation in which personal documentation was more common, and partly because his long tenure on the Cutty Sark and his genuine love for the ship gave him more to say about her than a captain who had commanded a vessel for a single voyage. Woodgett's accounts of driving the Cutty Sark through the Southern Ocean, the descriptions of the seas and the ship's behaviour in extreme conditions, have some of the quality of good adventure writing, detailed and vivid without being melodramatic, and they convey the experience of sailing a great clipper at the limit of her ability in the way that the formal logbooks cannot. When you walk into Greenwich in southeast London today, you encounter the Cutty Sark in a setting that would have been entirely incomprehensible to the men who built and sailed her. She sits in a dry dock in the heart of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, surrounded by the Baroque architecture of the former Royal Naval College, the National Maritime Museum just up the hill, and the observatory where Greenwich Mean Time was established. She's been polished and restored and maintained with a care and expense that would have seemed absurd to John Willis, who fought and argued over every penny of the ship's running costs throughout her commercial career, and who sold her for a fraction of what she had cost to build. The restoration completed in 2012, following the 2007 fire, raised the ship a few feet above the floor of the dry dock so that visitors can walk underneath her hull and see the underwater lines that gave her speed. This is, from a certain perspective, the most interesting view of the ship, because it shows you the engineering directly, the sharp bow entry, and the clean run of the hull to the stern. the way the lines come together in a form that is both geometrically precise and intuitively correct, that looks, even in dry dock far from any water, like a thing designed to move through a fluid with minimum resistance. You can put your hand on the copper-sheathed hull below the waterline and feel the curve that the Aberdeen designers calculated and the Dumbarton workers shaped, and connect that curve directly to the speeds recorded in the logbooks of 140 years ago. Above the waterline, the ship has been restored to something close to her appearance in the late 19th century, with her distinctive black and gold colour scheme and her elaborate carved figurehead of Nanny reaching forward from the bow. The masts and rigging, though not complete in the way a working ship would have had them, are enough to give a sense of the scale of the rig that was carried, to make you look up and calculate the height and breadth of the canvas that once spread from these spars, and to understand in a visceral way why those records were what they were. The museum within the ship and in the visitor facilities around it tells the story we have been following through this long night of narrative, the China races and the wool trade and the various captains and the decades of working life and the long road to preservation. It tells it well, with artifacts and documents and models and the physical reality of the ship herself, providing what no other medium can, the sense of scale and substance and material reality that photographs and descriptions can only approximate. What strikes most visitors, if the visitor reactions recorded in the museum's own documentation are any guide, is the smallness. The Cutty Sark is not a large ship by the standards of the ocean-going vessels that followed her. 212 feet seems substantial on the dock, but when you try to imagine 16,000 miles of open ocean from the deck of a ship this size, the scale of what the clipper captains and their crews did becomes suddenly and forcefully apparent. The Indian Ocean is not a theoretical quantity when you are standing on the deck of the ship that crossed it. The Southern Ocean is not an abstraction when you can see, on the mast above you, where the strong winds would have loaded the sails with a force that the whole structure was designed to endure. The 1866 race becomes not a set of dates and distances, but a physical reality, achieved by real people in this actual vessel, and the emotional weight of that reality is quite different from what any account of the events can convey. The end of the Age of Sail is a story that has been told many times and in many registers, from the celebratory, marking the progress of steam, and the rational triumph of efficient technology over romantic but inefficient tradition, to the elegiac, mourning the loss of something beautiful and irreplaceable in the grey advance of industrial modernity. Both registers capture something true, and neither captures the whole truth, because the reality of what happened when steam displaced sail was not a simple story of progress or of loss, but a complex renegotiation of the relationship between human skill and mechanical power that is still continuing. What was lost with the tea clippers was a form of expertise, a body of knowledge about how to manage a sailing ship in all conditions of wind and weather, that had been developed over centuries and that reached its highest expression in the hands of the men who drove the racing clippers around the world. This expertise was not merely technical, it was tactile and intuitive and somatic, lodged in the bodies and nervous systems of the sailors who had acquired it over years of physical engagement with ships and the sea, and it was not the kind of knowledge that could be written down in a textbook or preserved in a manual for later recovery. When the last generation of clipper sailors died or retired, the knowledge died with them, not completely, because some of it was recorded and some of it persisted in the traditions of the professional yachting world, but substantially, in the way that any tacit expertise is diminished when the practice that generated it ceases. What was kept was the understanding, the recognition that what the clipper era had achieved was extraordinary, that the ships and the men who sailed them represented a pinnacle of a particular kind of human activity that deserved to be remembered and honoured. This recognition was present even as the era was ending, expressed in the journalism and the maritime literature of the 1870s and 1880s, and it has deepened and broadened in the century and a half since, as the distance from the events has allowed the cultural significance of the clipper era to become clearer. The Cutty Sark in Greenwich is the physical embodiment of this recognition, a statement in wood and iron and copper that this mattered, that what happened on the Min River on May 29th, 1866, and in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, and the South Atlantic and the English Channel over the 99 days that followed, was an achievement worth preserving in material form as a monument to human skill and competitive courage. She's not a relic of a dead world, preserved merely for antiquarian interest. She's a statement about the kind of achievement that endures, The kind of thing that human beings at their best can do when they combine intelligence and skill and competitive desire with the raw physical resources of wind and wood and water. Foochow today is a modern Chinese city of nearly 8 million people, a manufacturing and commercial centre that bears very little physical resemblance to the Foochow of 1866, the city of merchants and tea factors and river junks and anchored clippers that was the starting point of the Great Race. The Min River is still there, of course, and still navigable, though the ships on it now are of a very different character from the tall-masted clippers that once rode at anchor in the stream. The mountains of Fujian behind the city still grow tea, Wuyi Oolong and Tiaguanyin, and the various grades of Kongu that filled the chests in the holds of Ariel and Taeping and Serica, though the market for these teas is now largely domestic rather than export, the enormous Chinese middle class having discovered the pleasures of high-quality Fujian tea in ways that the export merchants of the 1860s could never have imagined. There are occasional historical markers in Foochow that acknowledge the city's role in the tea trade, and scholars and enthusiasts have documented the locations of the old foreign trading posts and the docks where the clippers loaded, but it is not a story that features prominently in the standard narrative of the city's history, partly because that history is told primarily from a Chinese perspective, in which the foreign merchants and their fast ships are a minor element of a much larger story about the development of Fujian and the broader transformation of China through the 19th and 20th centuries, and partly because the tea trade that drove the clipper races was also connected to the opium trade and the unequal treaties that are a more complicated legacy to commemorate. The tea itself, which was the ultimate cause and purpose of everything described in this account, has changed enormously in both its production and its consumption since the 1860s. The mountain tea gardens of Fujian are still among the finest in the world, producing teas that command extraordinary prices in the high-end tea market of the 21st century, but they are now thoroughly embedded in the global luxury food economy rather than in the imperial trading system that the clippers served. A first flush Wuyi da Hongpao, one of the rarest and most expensive teas in the world, might sell today for prices per gram that would have seemed impossible even to the most speculative Victorian tea merchant, but the premium is paid for different reasons, for the combination of terroir and craft and scarcity that defines luxury food in the contemporary world, rather than for the freshness achieved through speed of transport. In all the accounts of the great races, in all the documents and logbooks and newspaper articles and retrospective analyses, what is most difficult to recover is the subjective experience of the ordinary sailors who sailed on the racing clippers, the men who stood the night watches and hauled on the braces and went aloft in the dark to take in or shake out canvas, and looked at the ocean around them with eyes that were simultaneously exhausted and alert, the eyes of men who had been at sea for 60 or 70 or 80 days and for whom the ship and the sea had become the whole world. The night watches were long on a clipper ship. 4 hours on and 4 hours off was the standard pattern, and the off-watch time was not entirely free, with all hands calls to shorten or make sail in changing weather conditions, pulling men back on deck before they had properly rested. The watch on deck in the middle of the night, somewhere in the Indian Ocean or the South Atlantic, was a particular kind of experience, lonely in some respects and companionable in others. The small group of men standing or moving on the deck, the only visible human presences in a world that stretched to every horizon without another light or another shape. The sky would have been extraordinary on clear nights, far from any land and far from any artificial light source, the Milky Way visible as a distinct band of light from horizon to horizon, the southern stars in their unfamiliar configurations, this southern cross standing out, above the horizon at the latitudes where the southern hemisphere showed its full face. Sailors of that era had an intimate relationship with the stars that the electric light has largely extinguished from modern experience, because the stars were navigation tools as well as aesthetic objects, and a sailor who could read the sky was a sailor who knew where he was even when the chronometer was unreliable or the logline was fouled. The sounds of a clipper ship at sea in the night watch are another thing that has been lost except in imagination. The working of the hull in a seaway, the timber creaking and the caulking shifting slightly as the ship flexed with each wave, sounds that would be alarming to the uninitiated but were simply part of the background noise of life at sea to the experienced sailor. The rigging, that complex hierarchy of wire and rope under varying loads, producing a range of sounds from the bass drone of a fully loaded stay and strong wind to the high whistle of a thin wire in a gust. The water alongside the hull, rushing and hissing at the bow and leaving a white wake that phosphoresced in tropical waters, glowing green and blue with the bioluminescence of the organisms disturbed by the ship's passage. The sound of the log line streaming astern, measuring the speed, the creak of the wheel as the helmsman made constant small corrections to maintain the course the captain had ordered. These were the sounds and sights of 99 days in the 1866 race, the sensory texture of an experience that produced the extraordinary result at Gravesend in September, 2 ships within 10 minutes of each other after 3 months and 16,000 miles. The sailors who lived through those days did not, for the most part, write about them in terms that conveyed the full weight of what they were experiencing. They wrote, if they wrote at all, in the understated way of men who had chosen a life that required them to normalise the extraordinary, for whom 16,000 miles in 99 days was simply a voyage, one of many, part of the work. Return now to London, to the Thames in the early morning of September the 6th, 1866. The light is the thin grey light of an English September morning, the sky overcast but not threatening, the tide running up through the lower estuary, with the flood that would carry both Ariel and Taeping to Gravesend and beyond, up through the reaches of the Thames toward the docks where the warehouses waited, and the agents were already awake, and the telegraph machines were already clicking with the news that the first clipper of the season was inbound. On the deck of Ariel, John Kay was watching the north bank of the Thames slip by, calculating the tide and the distance and the position of Taeping somewhere behind him, knowing that the race he had been sailing for 99 days was now measured in miles rather than thousands of miles, in hours rather than months. He had pushed his ship and his crew across 2 oceans and around a continent, had made 1,000 decisions in the dark and the storm and the calm, had navigated by the stars and the log and the barometer and the accumulated wisdom of his experience, and now the warehouses of London were ahead, and the finish was coming, and he was going to be first. He was first by 10 minutes. By 10 minutes out of 99 days, by 10 minutes after 16,000 miles, by a margin so small as to seem almost arbitrary when set against the scale of the enterprise. John Key brought Ariel to the line ahead of Donald Mackinnon and Taeping. The crowd that had gathered, because crowds did gather for the arrival of the first tea clipper of the season, saw both ships come up the river within sight of each other, and they understood what they were witnessing, that this was the conclusion of something extraordinary, that these 2 battered and travel-stained ships represented 99 days of human effort applied at the highest level of competitive skill against the largest possible arena, 10 minutes, 14,400 seconds out of 8,569,600 seconds of total elapsed race time, a margin of 0.16 of 1%. The precision required to produce that result, the sustained excellence over 3 months of independent navigation across weather systems that no one could predict or control, is an achievement so improbable that it seems to require an explanation beyond the merely statistical. But the statistical explanation is there. 2 ships of approximately equal quality sailed by 2 captains of approximately equal skill over a course where both face the same general conditions will, on average, arrive at approximately the same time. The remarkable thing about the 1866 race is not that the margin was 10 minutes. The remarkable thing is that it was as close as 10 minutes, that the competition was close enough for such a margin to be the result. And then the docks, and the unloading, and the weighing and assessing of the tea, and the merchants comparing the quality and the weight and the taste, and the premium being paid and argued over and eventually settled, and the captains and crews being paid off and dispersing into London and the world, to rest for a few weeks before the process began again. Another season, another loading in Foochow, another race down through the South China Sea and across the Indian Ocean and around the Cape and up the Atlantic, another chance to be first, to earn the premium, to be the fastest. The great age of the tea clippers lasted, in its truest competitive form, from roughly 1850 to roughly 1875. That is a quarter of a century, which seems both long and short depending on your perspective. Long enough to produce dozens of great ships and to define the culture of the China trade. Short enough to be comprehensible as a unified episode, a distinct chapter in the larger history of maritime commerce, the 25 years when sail achieved its most perfect expression and then yielded, reluctantly, to steam. The legacy of those 25 years is out of proportion to their brevity. The clipper ships are remembered when hundreds of more economically significant steamships are forgotten, not because the clippers were more important in any objective commercial or historical sense, but because they were beautiful and fast and the men who sailed them were competing at the edge of what was humanly and technically possible, and because that combination of beauty and competition and the edge of possibility is something that the human imagination responds to with a consistency that transcends the particular circumstances that produced it. When Captain Key brought Ariel up the Thames on that September morning in 1866, 10 minutes ahead of Taeping after 99 days at sea, he was completing a journey that had begun on the docks of Foochow with the smell of fresh tea in the air and the tide running and the wind uncertain. He could not have known, standing on his quarterdeck as London appeared through the morning haze, that what he had done would be remembered 150 years later, that people would still be talking about those 10 minutes and those 99 days and those 16,000 miles long after everything else about the Victorian tea trade had been reduced to statistics in economic history textbooks. He knew he had won. He knew it was close. He knew that Mackinnon had sailed a race that deserved better than second place, or more accurately, that deserved a recognition that the commercial framework of the prize money could not adequately express. He probably knew, though the certainty of hindsight was not available to him, that the era that had produced and sustained the great races was already changing, that the canal being dug through the Egyptian desert would alter the economics of the trade, and that the steam engines in the ships tied up in the London docks were already capable of crossing the Indian Ocean and would soon be capable of crossing it more reliably, if not quite more quickly. But these were thoughts for another day. On the morning of September the 6th, 1866, Ariel was first, and the tea was the freshest in London, and the premium would be paid, and the crew would be stood down and paid off, and the ship would be warped into the dock, and the hatches opened, and the chests of Foochow tea would come up into the English morning air for the first time since they had been loaded on the Min River, carrying with them the green fragrance of the Chinese mountains and the salt memory of 2 oceans, and that was enough. That was everything. The sea gives nothing back once it has been crossed. The wake closes behind the ship and the water is undisturbed, as if no keel had ever passed that way. Only the records remain, the logbooks and the newspaper accounts and the prize money receipts and the faded photographs, and the single ship in her dry dock in Greenwich, standing in the London air as testimony to what was done, and what was risked, and what was achieved in the years when the wind drove the finest ships ever built across the longest distances any merchant vessel has ever raced, faster than anything that had come before, and never to be equalled again. For those who wish to carry the story further, here is the fuller accounting of each major vessel and the fates that found them, gathered from the shipping registers and the Lloyd's records and the maritime press that followed these ships with the attention of devoted admirers throughout their working lives. The Ariel was built by Robert Steele and Company at Greenock in 1865, launched on April 21st of that year, and she entered the China trade immediately. Her dimensions were 297 feet in length, 33 feet 9 inches in beam, and she measured 946 tons under measurement. She was considered at her launch to be the finest clipper afloat, a judgment formed by the shipbuilders and merchants and naval architects who had seen many fast ships but found in Ariel a refinement of form and construction that set her apart even in that company. Her career in the China trade was distinguished before the 1866 race, and the race simply confirmed what her performances had already suggested. After her loss in 1872, the circumstances were never fully established. She was last seen in the South Atlantic, homeward bound, and then she was simply not there when expected in London, and the search that was conducted found nothing. The insurance was paid, the crew listed as lost, and the maritime community added her name to the register of ships whose fates the sea had chosen not to disclose. There is something fitting, perhaps, in the completeness of her disappearance, a ship that had been so absolutely and perfectly a creature of the sea returning to it without remainder. The Taeping, launched in 1863 also by Robert Steele, was slightly larger than Ariel at 866 tons and 218 feet in length. She had sailed the China run successfully for 8 years before her wreck on Ladd's Reef in 1871. The circumstances of the wreck were the usual ones. Navigation in the South China Sea was always hazardous, and the charts were not always reliable in the way that modern electronic navigation has made sailors expect charts to be reliable. A reef in the wrong position on the chart, or a current running stronger than expected, or a moment of inattention at a critical time, any of these could end the career of the fastest and finest ship afloat, and Taeping's ending was abrupt and total, The ship struck and did not come off, and what the salvagers found was not worth saving. The Serica, launched in 1863 and measuring 530 tons, was the smallest and arguably least celebrated of the great trio of 1866, which somewhat obscures the remarkable achievement of her performance in that race. To finish on the same day as Ariel and Taeping, to arrive on the same London tide after the same 99 days, in a ship that was conceded to be in the second rank of the competing vessels, required seamanship of the highest order from Captain Innes. Serica continued in the China trade for some years after 1866, her later career less documented and less celebrated than her finest hour, before eventually being sold out of the tea trade and converted to other purposes. The Fiery Cross, which also left Foochow in 1866 as part of the same departing fleet, and which had been a consistent competitor in the races of previous years, finished the 1866 race well behind the leading three ships, arriving in London some days later. Her career stretched back to the early 1860s, and she was a respected vessel in the trade, but she was perhaps at the end of her competitive prime by 1866, and the emergence of the newer, sharper-built ships like Ariel and Taeping had left her in a position where a place in the first rank was difficult to sustain. The Thermopylae, as described at length in the body of this account, was built by Walter Hood and Company at Aberdeen, launched on August 19, 1868, and she entered the China trade with a series of performances that immediately established her as the outstanding vessel of the era. Her dimensions, 212 feet in length and 36 feet in beam, measuring 948 tons, were similar to but not identical to the Cutty Sark, and the differences between the two ships in their underwater lines and their sail plans were a subject of detailed technical discussion among the naval architects and maritime journalists of the day. The consensus, for what it is worth, is that the two ships were very closely matched, and that the conditions on any given day or any given passage might favour one over the other, which is probably the honest answer to the question of which was the faster, and which would therefore have won the races that were never run under fully comparable conditions. The Thermopylae's sail to Portugal, and her subsequent use as a naval training ship, represented the typical fate of a great sailing vessel in the age of transition from sail to steam, the finding of some alternative employment that kept the hull working while the world moved on. The Portuguese navy found her sound enough for the purpose of training young sailors, and for a dozen years or more she served in that capacity before her final and unglamorous disposal as a torpedo target in 1907. The Portuguese presumably chose the method of disposal with some consideration of its symbolism, the torpedo being the embodiment of the industrial military technology that had made sail obsolete, and there is a certain grim appropriateness in the fact that the great Thermopylae was ended by exactly the kind of technological force that had already superseded everything she represented. The Cutty Sark's story after her working years ended, and before her preservation at Greenwich, is worth tracing in some detail, because it illuminates something about the way cultures decide what to preserve and what to let go. When Willis sold her to the Portuguese firm of J. F. Ferreira in 1895, she was renamed Ferreira and put into the trade between Portugal and Brazil, carrying general cargo rather than the tea or wool that had been her cargoes in her competitive years. She was well maintained by her Portuguese owners, who had bought a sound ship and used her sensibly, but she was no longer celebrated or even particularly recognised as what she had been, her history obscured by the change of flag and name. The encounter in Falmouth Harbour in 1922 between the retired sea captain Wilfred Dowman and the ship he recognised as the Cutty Sark is one of those moments in the history of heritage preservation that has the quality of a coincidence too, perfectly timed to be entirely coincidental, though coincidence is probably the correct explanation. Dowman had seen the Cutty Sark under sail as a young man, had been impressed by her, and had remembered her in the way that sailors remember the great ships they have encountered, with a specificity of detail that persists through years and changes of circumstance. He recognised her in Falmouth despite the Portuguese name on her stern and the changes of 30 years, recognised the hull and the lines and the character that the passage of time had not obliterated, and bought her out of sentiment and the simple desire that a great ship should not be lost. Dowman's restoration of the Cutty Sark to something close to her original appearance was a labour of love conducted with the limited resources available to a retired sea captain of modest means in the early 1920s. He got the rig substantially correct, restoring the masts and yards and much of the standing rigging to the configuration of the wool trade years, and he repainted her in the black and gold scheme that she had worn in her best days. She was used as a training ship at Falmouth, and after Dowman's death his widow continued the work before eventually arranging the ship's transfer to the Thames Nautical Training College, which used her for the same purpose on the Thames for several more decades before the final decision was made to preserve her permanently in dry dock at Greenwich. The 2007 fire was caused by an industrial vacuum cleaner left running unsupervised overnight during the restoration work that was already underway when the fire started, a cause so prosaic and preventable that it adds a particular kind of bitterness to the significant damage that resulted. The hull below the waterline was largely protected by the way the ship had been lifted in her dry dock, but much of the above-deck structure was damaged and some irreplaceable original material was lost. The subsequent restoration took 5 years and cost approximately £50 million, a sum that would have built several Cutty Sarks in 1869 at current prices, and which reflects the value that the 21st century places on maritime heritage of this quality. The tea that filled the holds of the great racing clippers was not a single commodity, but a complex and differentiated product, with a hierarchy of quality and character that the Victorian tea trade understood in considerable detail. The Foochow teas that dominated the earliest cargoes of the season were mostly of the type known as Kongu, black teas from the Fujian province, produced by a specific process of withering, rolling, oxidizing, and firing the leaves that gave them their characteristic flavour, a full-bodied but relatively smooth taste that made them suitable for blending with other teas and for the kind of everyday consumption that constituted the bulk of the British tea market. Above the Kongu in the quality hierarchy came the oolongs, partially oxidized teas that occupied a position between green and black, with a character that connoisseurs described as floral or fruity, and that commanded higher prices for the finest grades. The earliest picked and most carefully processed oolongs from the high mountain gardens of Fujian were among the most expensive teas in the British market, and the first chests of these to arrive on a racing clipper were genuinely worth the premium they commanded, the fresh, volatile compounds in the leaves not yet having dissipated in the way they would over a longer voyage in the heat of the hold. The connection between speed of delivery and quality of product was real and measurable, though modern tea chemistry provides a more precise account of the mechanism than the Victorian merchants could offer. The aromatic compounds in fresh tea leaves, the terpenes and esters and alcohols that give different teas their distinctive characters, are volatile, meaning they evaporate relatively easily, and they also undergo chemical changes over time, particularly in warm and humid conditions. A tea chest in the hold of a ship crossing the tropical Indian Ocean was in conditions that accelerated these changes, and the difference in flavour between tea that had spent 60 days in such conditions and tea that had spent 90 days was not merely theoretical, it was detectable by any experienced taster. The practice of blending, which was central to the Victorian tea trade, meant that the quality of the individual cargoes was often less important commercially than the availability of early supplies for the blenders to work with. A major tea merchant who could offer his blended teas to his customers before his competitors could offer theirs had a commercial advantage that went beyond the quality of the individual components, and this advantage was what the premiums for first-of-season tea were ultimately purchasing. The merchants were buying time, the ability to be first to market, and the clippers were the vehicles that delivered that time advantage. The transformation of the British tea market that occurred in the decades following the great clipper races was driven partly by the opening of the Indian tea trade, particularly the development of the Assam and Darjeeling tea industries in the 1870s and 1880s, which created a supply of British-grown colonial tea that did not need to come from China at all, and that could be transported on the much shorter route from Calcutta. Indian tea was different in character from Chinese tea, stronger and more astringent in the style that became the standard for the British breakfast tea market, and its rise to dominance represented a shift in the taste of the British tea-drinking public that is still reflected in the character of the standard British cuppa today. The mathematics of wind and sail, for those inclined toward the technical dimensions of the clipper story, the question of how these ships actually achieved their remarkable speeds, is worth exploring in some detail, because the physics involved are genuinely interesting, and the solutions the Victorian designers arrived at represent elegant engineering in the truest sense. A sailing ship generates driving force from the pressure difference between the windward and leeward sides of each sail, a mechanism closely analogous to the lift generation of an aircraft wing. The sail, when correctly trimmed to the wind, acts as an airfoil, with air moving faster over the leeward face than the windward face, creating a pressure differential that produces a force roughly perpendicular to the sail surface. This force has a forward component, which drives the ship forward, and a sideways component, which tends to push the ship sideways and heel it over. The hull, by virtue of its depth in the water and the resistance of the water to sideways motion, converts most of the sideways force into additional forward drive through a complex mechanism involving the water flowing over the hull surfaces, the same mechanism that generates lift from a sailing vessel's keel. The net result, when all the forces are in balance, is a ship moving at an angle to the wind, driven partly by the forward component of the sail force and partly by the hydrodynamic lift generated by the hull, moving sideways through the water. A clipper sailing at its best was in a state of dynamic equilibrium among all these forces, the sails generating the maximum possible driving force, the hull converting that force efficiently into forward motion, and the helmsman maintaining the precise course that kept the balance optimal. Any deviation from the optimum, any slight over-trimming or under-trimming of a sail, any small error in course, reduced the efficiency of the system and cost speed. The captains and mates who sailed the racing clippers developed an intimate understanding of these relationships through experience, not as physics, but as feel. The feel of the ship through the deck under their feet, the sound of the sails and the rigging, the behaviour of the wake, the reading of the log line. They could not have written down the equations that described what they were doing, but they could perform the optimization intuitively in real time, adjusting and correcting continuously in ways that kept their ships at or near their theoretical maximum speed for sustained periods. The maximum speed of a displacement hull, a hull that moves through the water rather than over it in the way of a planing powerboat, is limited by the speed at which the wave the hull creates at the bow would travel. This hull speed, as it is called, is proportional to the square root of the waterline length, and for a clipper of 200 feet at the waterline, this works out to roughly 15 knots. The tea clippers achieved speeds close to and occasionally exceeding this theoretical maximum in favourable conditions, surfing down the faces of large waves in the Southern Ocean in a manner that briefly lifted them above the displacement hull speed limit, in the same way that a surfer on a wave moves faster than the wave would in open water. The best recorded speed runs for the great clippers were in these surfing conditions, and the figures that appear in the logbooks for these occasions, 17, 18, sometimes claimed speeds above 20 knots, need to be understood in the context of brief surfs rather than sustained average speeds. The practical measurement of speed at sea in the 1860s was done with the chip log, a wooden drogue thrown over the stern attached to a line with knots tied at regular intervals, and the number of knots that paid out over a 30-second sandglass gave the speed in knots per hour, which is the origin of the nautical term for speed. This was not a precise instrument by modern standards, and the logbook entries of 14 or 15 knots sustained for hours at a stretch were genuine and repeated observations rather than isolated moments, observations that give a reliable picture of what these ships were capable of in good conditions.